Hello, everyone. This is a great crowd. Very excited to have Adam-Lashinsky here, who I'll introduce in a minute. Just want to say for all the people watching from wherever you're watching from, this is taking place in Mountain View, California, at the headquarters of LinkedIn. We have with us today Adam-Lashinsky, who is a senior editor at large at Fortune, has spent his entire career traveling the halls of power, interviewing some of the most important people in business, from Meg Whitman, Mark Hurd, John Doerr, you name the leader, and Adam has sat down with him or her and talked about what it takes to run a big company, a small company, what it takes to succeed, why certain people fail, why others don't. He's been doing this for a while. We worked together at Fortune, and Adam was always a joy to work with, because he is such an in-depth reporter and manages to get people to tell him things that they didn't want to tell him in the first place, or they didn't intend to tell him, or that they've never told anyone else. And you can see that very much in his book, Inside Apple, which comes out next week.
Yes, January 25th.
January 25th. This is his very first speaking engagement, so we're especially honored to have him here. Great. And he just flew in from New York this morning, so if he starts getting nonsensical at any time, you know why that is. So there's a couple different things I think we'll want to cover here. One is the culture of Apple. Two is what we can learn from Apple, what businesses can learn to do and what not to do from Apple, whether what they've done is replicable and what the future holds, and also what it was like writing a book with one of the most secretive companies, about one of the most secretive companies in the world. First, just to set the stage, the portrait of Apple that you paint is one of a company that is almost the opposite of what business has been told to believe that is how you run a company. This sort of Silicon Valley, internet-based approach to thinking about how you do business. Open, bottoms up, make your employees feel happy and successful at what they do. Make sure that people leave and go somewhere else, and they'll come back and you learn from where they go. You don't mind seeing people leave because you are taking people from elsewhere. It's all about pollination. Apple is secretive. It is top-down. It's closed more than open. They don't, instead of launching something and constantly making it better, they try to launch something perfect. They don't focus on user data. They focus on what they believe is right, and they look to see how it does. Is this a company that is replicable, that does have something to teach other companies, or is this a company that that only exists as Apple, that no one can ever create again?
So let's start with a little history, and I think what's really interesting about the way you position the question is in terms of Apple's culture is that 15 years ago and more, Apple was, first of all, a completely different company than it is today. But for a very long time, Apple was apart. So it was this, it's very hard for us to get our heads around this today in 2012, but Apple was this really niche manufacturer of computers that had 3 to 5% share of the market, that had gone a separate way from what the Wintel world had gone. And it had thrived for a while, then it had failed for a good long while, then it was trying to come back for a while. And Apple existed apart from Silicon Valley. I've even felt this when I first came here in 1997, and I paid almost no attention to Apple at the time. And I would meet people in the Valley. Most people in the Valley had no interaction with Apple. It was very binary, right? You either did or you didn't. And odds are you didn't, because they were small. And in the same way that, this is sort of jumping ahead in the story, but if you think about it in an ecosystem sort of way, their ecosystem was small. And if you were going to make components, you were going to make components for the Wintel platform, because that was a much bigger opportunity. So Apple developed apart. Its people didn't mix, generally speaking, with other people in the Valley. It didn't do a ton of business with people in the rest of the Valley. And so it was this little island. You know, Steve Jobs was very much of Silicon Valley, but Apple really wasn't in the same way. So you asked me, can it be replicated? There's a big part of my book is about that question, and we can drill down into what can be and what can't be. Apple's a very different company today. It's no longer just a computer company. As a matter of fact, computers make up a relatively small part of the revenue, sort of shockingly small part of the revenue. Off the top of my head, I think it's about 20%. And now Apple's in the phone business. It's through iTunes. It's in the entertainment business. It has relationships in lots of different areas that it never did 10 years ago. And you know, you should probably guide me, Dan, in terms of which aspects of its unique culture can they or can they not be replicated. Right. If you want to start with I think we could start with transparency. Absolutely. And openness. So you know, this was one of the things that was an epiphany for me working on the story and working on the book. I knew as a journalist that Apple's a very closed place. Apple could not be less kind, for lack of a more artful way of putting it, to journalists. They treat journalists shabbily, unless you're one of 2 or 3 people, which I get into in the book. And Apple's relationships are very one-sided. It's about Apple. And in terms of journalism, for example, the conversation is about their products. That's the conversation they want to have. They don't want to have any other conversation. They don't want to have a conversation about how the company works, which is what my topic was. They don't want to have a conversation about who their executives are and what their path to success is, irrelevant to selling product. Apple is all about selling product. So I understood as a journalist that they weren't very open. What I learned is that they're not very open to anybody. Now, and the excerpt that's in Fortune magazine, and the new issue of Fortune, is my chapter in the book on secrecy. It's a very secretive organization. All companies are secretive in terms of trying to keep their secrets from the outside. My realization is that Apple is incredibly secretive inside. They keep secrets from each other. Can this be replicated? I think that there probably isn't a company in America that couldn't use a dose of a little bit more discipline and focus than they have.
Well, talk about what it's like to work inside Apple and how that secrecy embodies itself. What kind of...
Sure. So to generalize, Apple is it's a work-oriented environment, and it's a task-oriented environment. You don't multitask at Apple. You have a task, and you're expected to focus on it and only it. And so I recount in the book that it's common when there's a big public keynote for people to congregate in one of the cafeterias and watch the keynote on a closed-circuit television. I mean, now people can watch from their desks on the web, but in the days before that, people would get together in the cafeteria. And the reason there was so much anticipation is that people wanted to see what the products were that were going to be released in the keynote because they didn't know. They knew about one feature that they worked on, or one aspect of one feature, and that's all they knew. Some of the byproducts of this are that kind of culture does not have leaks, and so that means no leaks to the press, no leaks to competitors, no leaks to customers. Because remember, in a product, a device product world, having customers know what's coming next can hurt existing sales. And Silicon Valley companies have screwed this up since time immemorial. They let word leak that a new version was coming, and guess what? The ones that were sitting on the shelves and in the warehouse never got sold and had to be junked at pennies on the dollar.
Well, you talk about people also you might get tapped for a position. You might get pulled into some kind of a secret project, and you can't even tell your boss what you're working on. Or talk about what it's like on the campus.
That's right. So there's instances where special rooms will be built. They call them lockdown rooms, or new doors or walls will be added with security badges. And Apple is a place of badging in and badging out constantly. But the badges aren't universal, so your badge might get you in that door, but my badge doesn't get me in that door. My badge gets me in that door. And I've had more than one person told me they had access to rooms that their superiors didn't have access to. There's a culture and a language of disclosure. So meetings will begin at Apple, and it's important for the person running the meeting to understand that everybody in the room has been disclosed on the topic. And it's a bit of a kabuki dance, because he's sort of looking and say, well, are you disclosed on...
That's the language you'll use?
Yeah, are you disclosed on such and such? And I try to figure out, and if I'm getting a vibe that you're not disclosed, I'm going to ask you to leave.
Wow. That seems to be the kind of culture then where ideas don't rise up from the bottom. Talk a little bit about how something is created, how they launch products. You talk a lot about the focus of the company in the book. How does that work?
So it's a unique situation, and this is the $300, $400 billion question is, what we know is that ideas came from the top under Steve Jobs. He's not the only person who had ideas, but he was the final arbiter of the ideas, and just, you know, an absolute dictator. And I say that in a non-judgmental way. It was his decision what was going to get made and what wasn't going to get made. You know, if you read Walter Isaacson's biography of Steve Jobs, there was a lot of simmering resentment that Steve would take credit for other people's ideas. It's not like nobody else could have an idea. It'd be very unlikely for somebody in the middle of the organization to have an idea that was going to become a major product area. You know, I don't know this, but I highly doubt there's a suggestion box at Apple. I don't want to minimize the influence or the power of the executive team, which is this group of about 10 to the CEO and are very powerful, and who absolutely have ideas. But there are skunk works at Apple. There are secret projects going on, you know, that may take years to come to fruition. What we know, and what Apple did very well for the 14 years that Steve Jobs was alive after he came back to Apple for the second time, is that Apple didn't do a lot of things. Tim Cook, the current CEO, would brag that they could put all their products on one conference room table. And you know, some of these stories get to be a bit hackneyed. It's become a more complex company. But the fact is, they still have this recollection that when Steve came back in '97 and brought on a new team of managers to help manage the company, they did gut every product in the company with 4 exceptions: 2 laptops and 2 desktops. And this was radical. To this day, and I note this in the book, I helped my father buy an all-in-one Hewlett-Packard PC recently, and I had just bought an iMac for myself around the same time. I mean, nothing could be easier than buying an iMac, right? I mean, there's basically 2 sizes of displays and there's 2 sizes of processors, and you make the decision how much money you want to spend. By the way, you're going to spend a lot more money. The HP SKUs were, you know, just this mishmash of horridly named, you know, like 321 SKG or whatever, and way too many of them.
Right. And I think that the culture today is we can give consumers choice. We will study the data. Let's get out there and give everyone can make all the choices they want, and we will then customize a product for them, which seems to work. Apple does not believe in that. It is, no. We know best.
Whether or not we know best, we trust our instincts to give the customer what we think the customer should have. And again, this is a very controversial topic because for a long time this was Steve's instinct. And the anecdote that I have in the book is that, and this actually was told to me by an ex-Apple person, but part of this anecdote comes from an ex-Google person, and I'm paraphrasing now, that Google, trying to decide what color palette to use on a certain web page, would put, you know, various shades of this color out to a million Google.com users, and it would analyze the click-through rates, and that would be the color that they would choose, the most popular one. It'd be, you know, very Google approach, very the ultimate crowdsourcing. And at Apple, Steve would review the color palette that his designers brought to him. You know, very talented designers who know color and think about this in a professional sense, and he would say, that one.
Right. So, so it all goes back to Jobs. What you know, I think this is the question that I'm sure you'll be getting from everyone.
Yeah.
And you've already gotten, even as you started working on this book, is what happens after Jobs? Is this something that can continue without him?
So first of all, don't believe anybody who tells you that they have the answer. I've found among serious Apple people, this is the equivalent of a religious war. You know, people have very strong opinions on this, and you'll find people who say, you know, company's going to hell, and you'll find people who say it's, you know, they've got so much in the pipeline and they've been so well trained on how to do their jobs that it's gonna glide along. So here's what I think: there's parts of the company that are going to have real challenges, because these are things that Steve did and that nobody else ever had the opportunity to lead. He was the head of advertising. He was the head of marketing, not product marketing, but marketing. He was the head of public relations, essentially, and so on. He didn't design the products, but he oversaw the design of the products. There's other things that he hasn't touched in 10 years. He brought in Tim Cook to run supply chain and logistics. Apple is world class at manufacturing things, even though they don't own any manufacturing capability. There's no reason to assume there'll be any hiccup in this. So a few more things. He trained his people. He started something called Apple University to try to institutionalize his teachings, the company's teachings, so that they could do things after him. I quote a former senior Apple software executive, Avi Tevanian, who said to me several weeks before Jobs' death, who said, you know, after Steve is gone, the competition still won't have Steve Jobs.
Right. So let me just make sure I'm understanding where you're coming from then. Apple continues to be successful because there is no other Steve Jobs at any of the competitors. They've got enough wind in their sails and enough products in the works that they can keep going.
I fall down mildly on the side of could they continue to be a great company. They can't be the same company. I think had Jobs lived, they wouldn't have been the same company. They're at a crossroads in a lot of ways. I mentioned earlier all these new industries that they're in. You know, they had this almost unparalleled 14-year run under Jobs. Yeah, we're just guessing what the next 5 years would have been like even if he had lived.
Right. Talk to me a little bit about what path people take when they, first of all, what's the mood like among employees inside Apple, and what kind of path do people take when they leave Apple? Is this a training ground for people to go on to other great things? Yes
and no, but largely no. And it's very unusual. So you have these companies in Silicon Valley and outside of Silicon Valley that are known as training grounds for talent. So for senior management, for example, there's ex-Oracle executives all over Silicon Valley. That may be because there was never an opportunity for any one of them to become CEO at Oracle because Larry Ellison wasn't giving up the job. But the same you would have thought the same would have been true at Apple. Apple is not a training ground for senior management to go other places. So focusing at the senior level to start, there is not one current example of a former senior Apple executive in a senior role elsewhere. We're starting to see some of these really talented people who left after 15-year careers at Apple and are still in their 30s or 40s starting companies. Mm-hmm. And Tony Fadell at Nest is a good example of this. But by and large, people were very loyal to Steve Jobs. And when they finally did leave, they were exhausted, and rich, mm-hmm. and they didn't do much. Now at the lower ranks, now the following is a generalization. So someone will criticize me for saying, well, this isn't how it was for me or my cousin or whatnot. But based on my reporting and the people I spoke to, it is not unusual for people to stay in their jobs at Apple for a very long time in their exact position. And they're well compensated. They're working at Apple.
When you say in their exact position, do you mean they don't actually move between products either, or they just don't move up with inside Apple?
More the latter. They may not move up. They'll keep doing the same function at the same level. This isn't seen as a bad thing. At any other company, if you're not moving up, you probably should be moving out, not necessarily at Apple. I quote someone in the book saying that they knew of more people who had been demoted at Apple than had been promoted, because it's not uncommon for someone to take a demotion because they get to stay at Apple.
Right. And you have a great line in there where you say a lot of people want to, the feeling is people who are not at Apple want to go to Apple, and people who are inside Apple want to leave Apple.
The joke is from everyone outside wants in and everybody inside wants out.
Right. So you said that they were loyal.
And again, I want to make a distinction that I mentioned in the book, which is that there's a grand and I find that when people read what I write about the mood at Apple, it's almost a Rorschach test. Most people read my article in Fortune or my book and they say, "Oh man, this sounds like a terrible place to work." I personally don't really think that. I think it's a really tough place to work. I don't think it's terrible. I think other people read it and say terrible, and because it's harsh. There's no doubt about that. There are the engineers let's say in the vast middle of the organization generally are very happy people. These are people who dreamed of working at Apple since they bought their first Apple IIe when they were in the 6th grade, and they've reached heaven, and they're there, and they're not necessarily going to become senior vice president, but they don't care.
So you might not love your job, but you love the product, you love the company, and so the job is fulfilling in many ways, because it sounds almost like they are a self-selected group who go seek out Apple because they love Apple in the first place.
You hear over and over that Apple people understand the mission of the company. They have bought into the mission.
Even before they start.
And they're they're helping Apple fulfill its mission. And you know, the suggestion is that being on a mission is perhaps more important than having a good time.
Right. I'll ask a couple more questions, and then we'll get some questions from everyone here. Let's say that someone's starting a company. They say, you know, it's not uncommon to hear someone say, I want to be the Apple of X, I want to be the Apple of Y. If they came to you, this startup entrepreneur, and said, what can I learn? What should I take home from how Jobs ran Apple, and what should I avoid in the way that Jobs ran Apple?
So, you know, this is actually a subject that Jobs spoke about from time to time, and so I'll channel him based on my, you know, reporting and my learnings. I would say, and I think he would say, okay, what are you good at? What are you really good at? No, I mean, what are you really good at that you think you can kick the competition's ass on and that you can do better than anybody else? That's what you should be doing. And by the way, do that. Don't do that, don't do that, don't do that. And make sure your idea is really good. And then don't let anybody tell you that it isn't. And make sure that you do what it takes to get it done. So, you know, this all sounds very simplistic, but for example, don't cut corners. Don't cut corners on the money. I mean, find the money and spend it. And so, you know, I raised him earlier. I have a section in the book where I talk about, so Tony Fadell was a very successful executive at Apple. He was the head of the iPod division ultimately. And he has this company called Nest that's making a learning thermostat, an intelligent thermostat. Really cool product. I think it's doing well. It looks like it could be an Apple product. No surprise, really. And so I interviewed him and said, what are you doing that's similar? What did you learn and what are you doing differently? And he said, well, we definitely don't spend like a typical startup. We spend lavishly where we think it's necessary. And the example that he gave me is they developed a custom screwdriver that goes that you get when you buy this thermostat. And that's because do-it-yourselfers are going to be a big part of their market. And they know, yeah, you've got a screwdriver at home, but this is the right sized screwdriver. Well, guess what? This screwdriver hurts their margins. They could make more money on this product without giving you a screwdriver, but they think that they'll delight the customers more by making sure, doing everything they can to make sure that the installation process goes well. So I said to him, okay, good point. Now, what are you doing differently than Apple? He said, well, it's more like Apple of 2001, 2002 or so, in that there's some euphemism. He said, we have a mutual relationship with Best Buy, because Best Buy is one of their most important channel partners. He implied there's a give and take between Nest and Best Buy. There's not much of a give and take between Apple and
dictates
anybody.
Terms to whoever they're doing business with, right? All right, so on the flip side of that question, or another version of that question, is someone's running a large company, and I think that you've answered this, but maybe it would be helpful to talk about what kind of advice Jobs gave to Jerry Yang, for instance, when he came in to be CEO of Yahoo.
When Jerry Yang was CEO for the second time of Yahoo, he brought Steve Jobs in to speak to a group of his executives. I'm fairly certain, I haven't verified this, that your CEO was one of them. And
is he here? We can ask. No.
Let's see him. And anyway, he asked Jobs to say a few words, and Jobs was very candid. He said, I can't figure out what Yahoo is, and I think you have to figure out what Yahoo is, and then you should go do it. And yeah, and everyone had an opinion about Yahoo. Was it a media company? Was it a technology company? He said, I have an opinion, but my opinion's not the one that matters. Your opinion is the one that matters. You ask, and so it seems simplistic. Tell a big corporation, well, decide what it is that you're good at. But most companies, I know I could do this with my own, can probably identify a few things that they're doing that they're not so good at. And maybe they shouldn't. Maybe they should be asking a tough question.
Right.
The thing that I think is, fertile ground for discussion is, do you want to behave the way Apple behaves? Do you want that kind of culture? Do you want to be known as a company that, and I use this language, which I think is pretty strong, that violates the golden rule of do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Do we want to admire that culture? I've got real misgivings about it. It's not the way I necessarily like to live my life.
Well, speaking of the culture, there's one part of it, though, that is not as well known, which is the idea of how people at Apple deal with the question of how much money they can operate with, about P&Ls, and I think the quote you use in the book is, I can't remember whether this is yours or you're quoting someone, is that they behave like rich kids, that they are, okay.
Yeah,
explain that.
So money is this fascinating topic with Apple. It's Steve Jobs was notoriously not about money, not about wealth, and Apple can be extremely frugal about, salaries are nothing special. For example, the offices are nothing special. For years they didn't have this glorious headquarters that they're building now, which is again like one of these really. It's very un-Apple actually to build that. It's also very un-Steve Jobs to be building a yacht when he died. I don't think people have made enough of that. Like we don't know how the next 20 years of his life were going. Why was this guy who lived in this home with no security in Palo Alto building a mega yacht like his friend Larry Ellison? It's just weird. But anyway, I digress, which is when it came to making or designing, I should say, or marketing the product, Apple would spend whatever it takes. And I have this anecdote in the book about when in 2005 when Apple was coming out with the first HD version of iMovie, Jobs decided, they knew that one of the biggest uses of iMovie was to shoot home videos of weddings. And so they needed a wedding to illustrate HD. And it was a great chicken and egg moment in the industry. A lot of people didn't have HD cameras, so HD was new, yet they needed to make an HD video to show people what HD could do. And they shot a wedding in San Francisco. It was an actual Apple employee's wedding. It was beautiful, very elegant, candles and whatnot. And Steve watched it, and this was I'm making up the exact timing, but I want to say mid-December. And Macworld was in about January 13th of that year. And he didn't like the wedding. He said it doesn't look right. It's elegant, and I want touching. I want exotic. I want bare feet on the sand. We need a tropical wedding in Hawaii. And they had about 3 weeks. And so anyway, I tell it in more detail in the book. But the team that was charged with this, they found the wedding in Maui, and they shot it, and they got it back in time, and they spared no expense to do it. Now, this became a 30-second clip in a keynote at Macworld, and I don't know how much they spent, because that was the one piece of information I couldn't get about this, but it didn't matter, because nothing was more important than illustrating the product well.
And no one has P&Ls at Apple, right?
Right. So the way the company is set up is that there's the CFO owns the P&L for the whole company. And the anecdote that I use is that when in '97 there were multiple advertising budgets at Apple, and it was ultimate fiefdom-oriented, divisionalized company. And Jobs said, you know what? As of now, there's only one advertising budget, and you're going to have to come to me and convince me why your product needs our advertising dollars. And it sort of looks brain dead obvious now, but it wasn't brain dead obvious in '97, because the net result was that they started to have this one company advertising, and they're very big on advertising heavily one thing, maybe two, maybe three, but not everything, because they've got this halo effect, because the brand is so strong that when you're advertising iPods aggressively, you happen to sell a lot of Macs at the same time. Anyway, the upshot is that they started spending more money on advertising in a fairly short period of time, not less. This was not about budget cutting, taking away the individual budgets. It was about being smarter with it.
Well, it all sounds like it goes back to the overall philosophy at Apple, which is control and focus. And I mean, everything that you talked about, from shooting, from the way that you market iMovie, is not to say here are all the million things you could do with iMovie, but you can shoot a wedding. We're going to show you how you shoot a wedding. And one advertising budget, one P&L, and all products that can fit on a conference room table. You're talking about a company that's exceptionally good at saying no.
And that was language that Steve Jobs used. It was more important to figure out what to say no to than what to say yes to, and that's part of the language of Apple is saying no. But I just wanted to, you reminded me of something where there's room here for somebody else to do a really great feature story. You know, the part that I left out about iMovie, and everybody who follows Apple closely jokes about this, is that the understanding was not just that you were going to get a wedding on the beach in a tropical location, but that the bride and the groom were going to be hot, right? And not hot in a sort of necessarily in a movie star, you know, like really buff hot, but really cute and just so, you just want to go up and you just want to give them a hug. These are, you know, the proverbial shiny, happy people. People in Apple marketing collateral are shiny, happy people, because if you buy an iPhone, you're going to be a shiny, happy person. They work really hard at this.
Right. That's great. All right, well, speaking of shiny, happy people, are there questions? Yes, this whole room here. If you want, we have a microphone in the middle. Just go ahead and, if you wouldn't mind, just introduce yourself before you ask a question.
Okay, my name is Carlos. I'm an engineer. And the last few years, Apple has really turned up the heat on their competitors with lawsuits.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you had any insight into kind of what motivated that and any ideas where they're going to go in the future.
You know, I'm going to make up an answer for you rather than give you one that's based on any reporting. I think for reasons that aren't clear to me that the older he got, the more pissed off Jobs got about, no, I don't mean in general, but I mean about intellectual property. And again, you know, for students of Apple, it's just sort of rich in irony because Apple was built on other people's ideas. You know, just starting with him borrowing the concept of the GUI from Xerox PARC. But and I think Walter Isaacson did a very good job in his biography of defending Apple. I don't think Apple stole the GUI from Xerox. I think it was there for the taking and they improved it. But anyway, I'm digressing from, it's just ironic that he would be someone who would get all up about Android looking a lot like the iOS. You know, I can't remember who now, I was talking to, I won't name him, but I was talking to a senior executive in that world in the middle of these patent wars. And his thesis was that this is because of there's a land grab going on, and we know there's going to be a relatively small number of winners, not a ton of winners, that we're in this intense warfare phase right now, but that this warfare phase will play out. I don't know if I agree with that, but it's as plausible an explanation as any to me.
Great.
Hey, thanks for being here. There's this almost mythical trip that Steve Jobs took to India, and it apparently changed him in a lot of ways. I was wondering if you could talk about how that influenced his life and his business philosophy.
Well, what I know about that is what I've read in books, and you know, starting with Michael Moritz's book, The Little Kingdom, and his retrospective, The Return to the Little Kingdom, and then Walter Isaacson's book, and I think if you know. You would not call Apple a Buddhist place, I don't think. You know, there isn't this sense of Zen calm. And I'm no expert on Buddhism, but there is, if he borrowed one thing from Buddhism, it's this notion of simplicity. That they do. They are Buddhist in the sense of being simplistic. And, you know, I talk about at the very end of the book that this will annoy some people or turn them off to me, but I'm not a Mac fanatic. I never was. I actually think that people like me are responsible for them being a $400 billion, or it's not 400, whatever, for being such a valuable company today. It's because people like me started buying Apple products. But anyway, my point is that, you know, it's the people who are real technologists have this love-hate relationship with Apple products because they love the simplicity, they love the things they can do, and they're deeply angry about the things that they can't do, right? And they're deeply angry about the things that don't work. But this was but what I can tell you is that it's a conscious decision at Apple. The things that they do and the things that they don't do are conscious. And if this may be myth building to say that this was a result of his sojourn in India, but you know, it's a pretty good story.
You know, you talk in the book actually a little bit about the idea of the process also, and of the idea if you're going to make tea, the sort of Buddhist idea, if you're going to make tea, concentrate on the process of making tea. And maybe you can talk a little bit about how at least you saw that channeled into, for instance, the creation of the iPod.
Well, there's a formal process at Apple. It's called the Apple New Product Process, and it's mainly a manufacturing thing in terms of what steps you're going to take. But they're elaborate planners. They don't want anyone knowing that, because they want this sort of, whimsical feeling about them. But there's a pecking order, and the pecking order, at the top of the pecking order is design. Industrial design is going to drive, where the product is going to go. Once they know they're moving, they have everything elaborately gamed out. Now, especially with Jobs, they were willing to blow the deadline, and they were willing to repeatedly throw out what wasn't working. But there is a plan.
I'm going to cut you off because I think, what I'd love for you to talk about is the idea of the creating the box, the iPod box.
Oh, the box. You said the iPod. Sorry.
iPod box. I'm sorry.
So I have this anecdote in the book where I talk about there's a room in the packaging design building at Apple where one package designer set up these prototypes of iPod boxes, and their specific task that I described was figuring out the right placement of that little cellophane sticker that closes the box. And I don't remember the number, but it's something like 150 of them. And this person was opening and closing and opening and closing and opening and closing. And then grouping 20 of them together to see how they would sit on the shelf and what would happen when you took one off the shelf, what would happen to the other one. And this would go on for weeks and months. And it seems absurd, except is there anyone in the room who has ever appreciated the box that their iPod came in or their iPhone came in, and the way that when you take your iPhone out of the box for the first time, there's a spring and it lifts up a little bit? I mean, and I say in the book, I mean, they didn't invent package design, but it's hard to think of another company being so obsessive about the customer experience of taking the cellophane label off.
Thank you for coming. We're all really excited to read or listen to your book.
Thank you. I recorded the video, the audio.
And I give you high praise for that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It was really fun and humbling.
It's clear that Apple's culture is very homogeneous, and they attract a lot of...
Homogeneous in what way?
The talent is very much alike.
Okay.
In fact, I did work for Apple for about 6 years, and I could tell it's sad, but just by looking at someone, whether they were going to be a good fit for the company or not during the interview.
Based on the 43 minutes I've spoken so far, how am I doing?
Very, very well, very accurate, and I can say, I'm not under any NDA, that a friend of mine who's a senior engineer, he works on, or did work on fake products, I'm sure, for the first part of his career, and interviewed for 9 months. It was intense.
Yeah, because I talk about the people being hired into dummy positions where they're just not sure what it is they're doing, and this is because even though you've been through this rigorous interview process, they still don't know if you can be trusted.
Mm-hmm. Right, yeah. Anyway, I was trusted. My question...
Congratulations.
My question to you is, what is the recipe for interviewing that you may or may not have observed? Hopefully you can comment on what creates the perfect Kool-Aid drinker as a hiree at Apple.
Well, you know far more about the interviewing process than I do. I haven't interviewed for a job at Apple, and I've spoken to people, and the only depth that I got to on that was that it was that it was rigorous, and so I'll give you one observation. You know, we live in a culture that celebrates ego, right? And we live in a culture that celebrates people. We sort of admire people who, who give it their all, but also promote themselves. And this is seen as generally good for the enterprise when people are advancing. You're advancing your career. You're advancing the company's interest. It's all real happy as long as you're around. Not at Apple. You have to be, someone clearly has to be willing to, and I think I use this expression, to check their ego at the door. For 14 years, there was only one ego that really mattered at Apple, and that was Steve Jobs's. And this is true I assume in the middle of the organization. It's very true at the highest ends of the organization. And this is, for senior Apple executives, truly bizarre. I mean, anywhere else, they would be famous people with, they might have their own PR person. They would have, their own budget to do this sort of thing, and they don't.
Yeah, there's good examples of this, like Ron Johnson leaving to become CEO.
Ron Johnson got more leash than most because he was outside the computer industry. He had a reputation when he came.
Just for background, Ron Johnson was the
head of Apple Retail, who had been a senior Target executive before joining Apple. And now he's at JCPenney.
Even Tim Cook has so much charisma that he could certainly be our next president. I could say that very, very confidently.
Tim Cook?
Yeah.
Next president. You agree with that?
You mean of the United States?
Yes.
Well, the only thing I would disagree is that I don't think he has the political chops to put up with the BS that politicians have to put up with.
In fact, Freakonomics recently said that the politicians shouldn't have to go through a certain rigorous exam for their political knowledge before being able to run. Anyway, thank you, Adam.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, my name is Michael. I work in sales operations. My question was, it sounds like Apple has been successful in building a sustainable, antagonistic internal culture. And I'm wondering how that works, what makes it work, and also what the benefit is of having that kind of clenched stomach feeling every day.
So, Apple is to sort of be cup half full about this, Apple is a cult of product. And I quote somebody in the book saying that, you come to a meeting, you have these nasty knockdown, drag out fights, but that if you can make the case persuasively about what is best for the product, you'll win. You'll win the argument. And so, it's not unheard of in corporate America for companies to encourage this notion of fighting, that fighting is going to lead to a better result than people being too kind to each other and focusing too much on consensus. Apple's not a consensus culture, as you can imagine. So, but it's also, to your point, to your question, it's a self-selecting place. If you can't take it, if you can't take that sort of being mentally beat up, you're not gonna cut it there. With the exception of certain areas where that doesn't apply, but generally, everywhere.
Talk about Papermaster. Papermaster,
right? Yeah, Mark Papermaster it's just an odd case. This executive who spent his career at IBM was hired to replace Tony Fadell as the top executive on iPod, and he didn't last very long. And one of the observations that someone made to me who knew him well was that he didn't know how to fight for his people. He was the kind of guy that you wanted to go have a beer with, but not necessarily who would go, not physically, but mentally beat somebody else up to defend one of his people. And he didn't last very long.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Michael too. One of the things Apple's been very successful at in transitioning to an entertainment company is getting content partners lined up. Obviously, that's been a big,
brilliant.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could comment on whether you think, again, post Steve Jobs, that Apple is in a strong enough position to continue to do that in other industries. The text put an announcement this week, right? Or whether that was a reality distortion field Jobs thing that's going to have a hard time continuing.
Well, I was on an airplane this morning when they made that announcement, so I read a little bit about it. So, I have a lot of thoughts on this entertainment question, which is at the highest level. I've never covered Hollywood. I'll ask Jeff to comment on Hollywood when he comes up to the mic. But there's one thing Hollywood really likes, and that's money. And Apple found some really good ways over the last 10 years to pay Hollywood. These were titanic battles, and at the end of the day, they came in with the checkbook. And they won Hollywood's respect in terms of movies and TV shows and music by paying them on Apple's terms. And after a lot of friction, by and large, the entertainment industry took it from Apple. And they've hired very good people. Nobody knows who they are, but they are. Some of these people actually live in Los Angeles, outside of Cupertino. I do identify this woman who is the head of product placement at Apple. Her title is Director Buzz. And she's been masterful at making sure that Macs and iPhones and iPads show up in all the important movies and television shows. She's helped by the fact that the creative people want those products on their shows. So, do I think they can continue to be successful in entertainment? You know, absolutely. The entertainment industry loves Apple. The creative people love Apple, and the business people love their money.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Please don't forget to introduce yourself when you come to the microphone.
Hi, my name is Jeff. I work at LinkedIn. Three things: a congratulations, a thank you, and a quick question. First, for those that don't know, I've known Adam for a long time. I consider him a friend, and he is one of, by far and away, the most talented and hardest working people who do what he does. And you know, I just want to say congratulations for the early reception to your book. It sounds like it's going to be an overwhelming success, and you are so deserving of this.
Thank you, Jeff.
So, second, thank you for making LinkedIn one of your first stops and what I think is going to be your very first stop. So thank you.
Thank you for having me.
I think this book is going to be a very big deal within business circles in Silicon Valley and beyond, so that means a lot to us. All right, the question. So I had the great privilege of attending an all-hands, if you will, at a previous company, and Steve Jobs was in attendance and spoke.
Yeah, we talked about that scene a little bit before you came.
Okay, so I drew from that something I've never forgotten, which was if you're going to really prioritize, you have to start with a simple question, which is if you could only do one thing, literally one thing, what would it be? And how challenging it was to answer the question. But it stuck with me. I think it stuck with a lot of people in the audience. You now know how this company operates as well, if not better than everyone on the outside. And you've learned a lot. You've been able to draw a lot of insights. Hypothetically speaking, you're flush with cash from the massive success of this book. You elect to start your own company. What are the few things that you would draw upon in terms of your learnings that you would take with you when you start your new company?
You know, I was ready for you to ask me what kind of company I would start, and I would tell you, as you well know, there's no way I would. You know, I'd go buy vacation homes and.
That's why I didn't ask that particular question.
And artwork and whatnot, but. You know, but I think it's instructive. I think I have to think about it in terms of, not in the abstract, but what would I do if I really did start a company? So let's say I would start a magazine or a publishing entity is really the right way to put it. And so if I were to do it the Apple way, first of all, I'm fabulously rich now, and that's helpful because I'm going to need resources to do this. We're not going to do it on a shoestring. And I would try to figure out, first of all, what I can do that's going to be new. There's no reason to do what somebody else is doing. I'm going to do what everyone else is doing in the sense that it's going to be publishing. It's going to be about storytelling. But you know, I'm going to get 2 or 3 or 4 people who I really respect and who have, by the way, who have complementary skills to me. There's not a lot of reason to have 3 or 4 Adam Lashinskys in this enterprise, because there's going to be some people who are much better at the other important things that we need to do this publishing entity. I think the beauty of doing this, and this plays to your strengths more than mine, is that we wouldn't even consider doing a print magazine, at least not initially. We would do something else to start. And I think we would do one thing. And I'm going to do a little bit of a cop-out. You know, I quote in the book, I quote Mike McHugh at Flipboard saying that, you know, when Flipboard started, it started as a single app on a single device. And they certainly could have created their app simultaneously for multiple platforms and multiple devices, but they just did the iPad. It took them an entire year, I think 18 months, before they even did the iPhone, and they still haven't done an Android app. And I asked him, you know, why not? And he said, well, we felt it's a sufficiently big project that we wanted it to be beautiful on the iPad before we went anywhere else. That's Apple kind of thinking, which isn't to say that Flipboard is going to succeed, but that's how Jobs would have gone about it too.
Great. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you, Adam. It's been great having you here. You're going to be signing books, is that right?
I'm ready, yeah. I'm
All right.
apparently signing books, whoever wants one.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.